All right, it is officially head coach signing season, as we've now had our third official head coach be announced here, and that is Brian Daboll going to the New York Giants. I think it's pronounced Daboll. Is it Daboll? I never really got that. I'll have to figure it out at some point now that he's a head coach. But it's interesting because obviously the reason why he is with the Giants now is because of the work he did developing Josh Allen. He's been the offensive coordinator there since 2018, and you could sit here and say, listen, Josh Allen's amazing, not the most difficult guy to develop, but he was actually very difficult to develop. Watch his early games, and he was not the Josh Allen we know now. So that's certainly a feather in his cap. It's very impressive what he was able to do with Allen, and he is someone who gets a lot of credit for that. Who knows how much of it was him and how much of it was anyone else in the building, but still, there's reason for optimism there for the Giants. Maybe he can unleash something in Daniel Jones, who did show some flashes last year and has shown some flashes his entire career, really. But what's interesting about Daboll is that his coaching career did not start there. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of the new hires. Should have mentioned this at the beginning. Talk about my thoughts on them because we've got a few hires now, so might as well get into them. So first with Daboll, he was let's look at the scouting report, right? He was with the Patriots from 2000 to 2006 as a defensive coaching assistant and eventually became a wide receiver coach. So another guy under the Bill Belichick tree, technically. And quite frankly, he's worked at a lot of places. He was the Jets quarterback coach for a couple of years. He was the Browns offensive coordinator from 2009 to 2010. That was his first stint as an offensive coordinator. Didn't go too well. Ran the 29th ranked offense, but how much of that is just talent? He was the Dolphins offensive coordinator for a year, the Chiefs offensive coordinator for a year. Worth noting that was in 2012 with the Chiefs, the year before Andy Reid got there, so no experience with Andy Reid. And then he eventually served as the Patriots tight end coach from 2013 to 2016, so went back to the Belichick coaching tree era. He returned to college football, interestingly enough, for Alabama in 2017, and then became the Bills' offensive coordinator. So interesting pathway for him to eventually become a head coach. And the reality is, you look at a lot of this stuff, there's one very impressive thing and then kind of a lot of it's interesting to me that he kept getting jobs. So I think that shows that he's doing something right, that head coaches like him and head coaches want him to be an offensive coordinator. So that's the bright spot, and that's the reason for optimism for the Giants, and also just what he's done these past couple of years with the Bills. It's not just Josh Allen carrying this talent. Like, he's called good plays. His X's and O's have been very good. He's worked at a lot of different organizations, and he kind of knows what works and what doesn't. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's positive. He can see what didn't work in some of these places, what did work in some places, and know what to do and what not to do. Head coaches are impossible to predict. Who knows who's going to be good and who isn't, but especially because, we're not in the interview, right? If we're in the interview, we can at least have a little bit more understanding of this stuff. But from what I can see, I don't hate this decision at all. I think Brian Daboll, absolutely, he's a guy who I think it makes sense to give him a shot. All right, let's talk about some of the other ones now, because there's two other ones. Let's talk about Nathaniel Hackett. So worth noting, he was the offensive coordinator for the Packers for the past couple of years, now going to the Denver Broncos. So the obvious thing that everyone's pointing to is this is them trying to get Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers likes Hackett, so there you go. Hackett's also only 42 years old, so another one of these young guys who has not worked under the Shanahan tree, but worked under a guy who, has that similar kind of idea with Matt LaFleur there, who has worked with Shanahan. So that's kind of a, similar style, which, listen, it makes sense, right? That's the kind of mindset that gets teams to have good head coaches. So that already gets you interested. You want to look at the scouting report. In 2010, he was hired by Syracuse as their quarterbacks and tight ends coach under Doug Marrone. Then in 2013, Doug Marrone was hired for Buffalo to be the head coach, and so Hackett was brought there. He was the offensive coordinator there as well. Marrone opted out of his contract following the 2014 season, and Hackett was hired by the Jaguars as an offensive line and assistant head coach, which is kind of an interesting position there. Eventually became the offensive coordinator for the Packers, though, and I think that's really what made things look good. I think some people might be a little bit concerned about, is this an Adam Gase scenario, right, where you're getting hired because you were close to a good quarterback instead of because you're actually good at stuff. And there's always that concern about hiring someone who's played with, who's coached with a great quarterback. I think that's a fair concern to have, for sure. I do. But I also think that, being into Matt LaFleur's system and also the positive things said about him, I like this hire. And listen, it's a nice bonus that he's close to Rodgers, right? Because you're going to try to make a push to see if you can get Aaron Rodgers if he becomes available. It's a nice bonus there, and it could make Rodgers want to go there. Although, again, Rodgers is not a free agent. He doesn't have that power. But, how much power does he have? If he tells the Green Bay Packers, I want to be traded to these teams, they might listen to him. But the reality is, I see the logic behind the hire. And again, I don't really look at this stuff as like, well, why didn't you hire this guy instead of that guy? Because I don't know how they did in the interviews. I don't know how good of leaders these guys are. All I can talk about is what I know. So let's go to Matt Eberflus. Difficult name to pronounce. Kind of fun. People have talked about how the Bears went from a Ryan and Matt to another Ryan and Matt. So that's kind of funny. But yeah, the Bears going after a defensive coordinator. And people are questioning that and wondering why they did that. Well, first, let's talk about his resume. So he spent the first 9 years of his coaching career at the University of Toledo, where he went to college as well. So interesting there, interesting start. That's where he started his career. And he was then the defensive coordinator of Missouri from 2003 to 2008 here. So pretty interesting how much time he spent in college, over 15 years in college. And he's only 51 years old, so he isn't an old guy. He's been coaching basically all his life. He then finally broke into the NFL as the linebackers coach for the Browns in 2009. And then he was the linebackers coach for Dallas from 2010 to 2015. So that's a long time to have one position. And, worth noting, something to bring up, like in 2014, the linebackers really performed well, even with a Sean Lee injury. So that's kind of that was a feather in his cap in his coaching careers. Linebackers in Dallas in his time were typically pretty good. And then his position was the defensive passing game coordinator for the Cowboys for a couple of years. That's where he was then. He eventually got hired in 2018 to coach the Indianapolis Colts as a defensive coordinator. And I have to say, Colts X's and O's on defense these past 2 years have been incredible. So there's really good stuff there with the X's and O's. And he's been a coach for a while. He's worked in different organizations. So again, if you like that about Brian Daboll, you probably like it about Eberflus. But the obvious question is, why aren't you going after an offensive guy to try and develop Justin Fields? Isn't that the idea? Shouldn't you be going after a guy to develop Justin Fields? And some people will say, well, who cares, right? Because you hired an offensive coordinator who can help Fields. But the flip side of all this is, it's easier to get a guy to be a head coach than it is to get a guy to be an offensive coordinator. People want to be head coaches. And also, you can't just hire an offensive coordinator from a different team. They can block you if you want to. You're allowed to block interviews if it's a lateral move. You're not allowed to block interviews if it's going to be moving up in the rankings. So, take your pick. If you wanted Eric Bieniemy, let's just say, that's a guy who you were considering. He's not going to go to the Bears to be an offensive coordinator. He might have gone to the Bears to be a head coach. So that's the argument. But the flip side is, listen, there's no guarantee of an offensive coordinator will make it that much easier to develop Fields than a defensive coordinator. I mean, obviously it matters, but you could just as much make the argument that having a good defense and allowing Fields to kind of relax a little bit, because one of the things that he has gotten in trouble with is feeling like he has to do everything, because in a lot of games he has had to do everything. Get the defense under control a little bit and make things a little bit easier for Fields, not force him to have to play hero ball sometimes, which is something that, especially in college, was an issue of his at times. So, I get the logic behind it. Again, out of all these moves, how many of them were the ones that I would make? I don't know. I like Daboll a lot. I think that he makes, what he's done recently makes sense. I like a lot of what I've seen from Eberflus, so I don't hate that one either. And even Nathaniel Hackett. Quite frankly, if I'm ranking them, I'd probably put Hackett number one, to be honest, just because I like getting to young guys who have worked with those other smart young guys. If you've worked with LaFleur, if you've worked for McVay, or if you've worked with Shanahan, I like you and I want to hire you, because that seems like that's a good, that works out pretty well. So, it's interesting stuff. Only 5 teams now without a head coach. You have the Raiders, who kind of do, kind of don't, because, it's a vacancy, but they did have an intern. Maybe they'll keep him. I don't know. You have the Texans, of course, the Dolphins, the Vikings, and then the Jaguars, technically. So there's some weird stuff where they maybe want Byron Leftwich, maybe don't. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet, so we'll see what happens. But still, 5 teams left. 3 now of head coaches. That's what I think about those 3. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from y'all. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.